So our next talk is going to be incident response from Michael McGrew. I'm getting really good at this surname pronunciation thing. It's getting better. And he's a security engineer here at Facebook. So welcome. Thank you.
Thanks. Awesome. Thanks, Nanda. And thanks, everyone, for coming out this afternoon to Security at Scale. Testing. Okay, this one. The title of this talk is Homebrew Incident Response. It was put together by a few people on our IR team, our manager, myself, Michael McGrew, and then another engineer on our team, Chris. Also, down there at the bottom, there's a link. It goes to facebook.com/protectthegraph. That's a Facebook page where we make technical posts about how we secure users on our platform or Facebook as a company as well. We have a few goals for these talks. Some things that we want to hit on is open sourcing IR playbooks and tooling and infrastructure, discussing IR implementation details, providing solutions, technical and procedural, to help you reduce your mean time to identification and resolution of an incident, encourage companies to stop winging it when it comes to IR, really plan out and think how you're going to do IR, and also hopefully promote dialogue between us and other companies and between other companies to talk about this problem. Let's go through a short illustration of why winging IR fails, and you should be doing preparation and testing those things that you've prepared to do. Say, for example, you have a fire in your house. Looks pretty bad. You're probably going to call 911. The fire department's going to come. They're going to hook up to the rig to get an initial source of water supply. After that, if they might need more water, they're probably going to think about hooking up to the fire hydrant. If no one's been checking up on the fire hydrant to make sure it's working, it's dispensing water correctly, it's dispensing the correct volume of water, it might look like this. That's a bad situation. Now you're in this situation. Your house is fully engulfed in flames, and this is a bigger problem that you have now. So you might think, okay, I need to bring in some bigger guns. Now what am I going to do? Maybe you're thinking I could bring in an airplane that's going to dump a whole bunch of water on it or something like that. Same situation with the fire hydrant. If no one's checking up on it, doing routine maintenance, making sure it's working, you might find it to be under a whole bunch of snow. And obviously a plane's not going to be able to operate correctly or even probably take off in this situation. And now the whole forest is on fire. Smokey the Bear is pretty unhappy with you, and so that's never a good situation either. This is why IR is here to stay. And it's really important to focus on, like I said, preparation and exercising those tools and procedures that you have prepared to use during an incident. A few quick notes before we start to go into the main slides. This presentation is only a portion of our IR plan where we have good defense in depth. So because of that, it shouldn't be viewed as holistic. We regularly do goal-oriented attack simulations, what we like to call red teams. And red teams allow us to exercise our IR plans and make sure that we are appropriately prepared. And these upcoming slides that I'm about to talk about are takeaways that we've had from those red teams. We're also going to emphasize on open source tool or free tools because we realize that companies have limited resources when it comes to developers or money or people on a team sometimes. Let's go into the state of affairs of IR and let's talk about the good. We've noticed that companies are investing in intrusion detection. That's good. They're maybe also developing data breach response plans, so talking to PR when this happens, maybe buying cyber insurance, thinking about how they would do business continuity planning. And they're also told to expect and prepare for a breach. The bad is that they're not often figuring out how they are going to conduct some of those more technical details of handling an incident, like, for example, how you would contain a laptop in a remote office, or let alone a production server in a remote data center. They're not really thinking about those details. They're also really investing in tooling or infrastructure that they're going to need during that incident. Like, for example, making sure that they're collecting the correct type of logs that they're going to need during the incident to help with scoping, or having semi-automated ways to do containment or eradication. Like the previous example, how would I contain a laptop in a remote office? Well, I could maybe think about how to do it on the fly, but maybe it'd be a lot better to have an automated way to do that. Also, not thinking about how they would want to build out tooling and infrastructure for local or remote forensics of something like memory or disk. And then not just the technical details of it, but they're not also following guidelines or models on how to handle an incident. Like, for example, if they come across a compromised asset, maybe they're immediately jumping onto that box and then tampering with evidence or time-stomping files or things like that. And or remediation or containment might be rushed. So, for example, if you notice you have 5 compromised assets over here, let's go and immediately contain those, but they don't realize the other 5 compromised assets over here, and that results in a direct notification to the attacker that you know they're there, and then they're going to switch to their tactics. The Containment Institute has done some research around this area. They surveyed 500 plus companies in a whole bunch of different verticals like defense, education, tech, agriculture, varying company sizes as well, small to large. And within 2 years, 43% of those companies expected or saw a loss of 1,000 or more sensitive records. And then of those companies, 60% saw another breach. So this is just illustrating that no matter what kind of company you are, no matter what size you are, you're probably going to see a breach and see more than one as well. And then also keep in mind with any statistics like this, we're only talking about companies that have noticed a breach and then reported them as well. Let's start with the basics. If we're going with a little visual example, maybe we're an ape here walking on all fours. We don't have very many capabilities in our IR tool bag. So let's go through some example questions that you should be able to ask of your networks or systems. And then we're also going to go through and figure out what kind of logs you would need to answer those questions. And this is really important because during the scoping phase of an incident, you're going to have a lot of questions that you want to ask of your network. You're going to say, what have I seen over here? What has this host seen? You're going to have a lot of questions you want to ask. If you don't have the correct logs to do that, then you've pretty much hit a brick wall. You can't continue with the scoping phase. Exercise 1, has anyone talked to evil.com on my network? Some native options that you might have on your network might be DNS server logs, or for example, if it was an HTTP request and the hostname is going to be in that request, if your firewall is inspecting the correct portions of that packet, you might see it in your firewall logs. Some foreign options that you could introduce into your network are things like proxies that everyone would have to go through to go out to the internet, or host agents that would be on your host, like maybe something like OS query that would tell you network connections that your host is making, or a network security monitoring platform that we'll discuss in a few minutes. If you would be using Microsoft for your DNS server, it's pretty simple to do this. You would enable packet logging. It would log out to that location there. And then you would, of course, want to collect these centrally where it's collected somewhere easy to search and do reporting and alerting and things like that. You could do that with maybe like Logstash or FluentD or the Splunk Universal Forwarder. If you're using BlueCat, another solution for DNS, it's pretty easy as well. You would go into those options, configure syslog, and then say I want to syslog out to this central syslog IP address over here, and then it would pump those events over to that IP address. You could also shoot them directly off to your SIM like QRadar or ArcSight out of the box with this product. Firewall egress logs, that should be a pretty standard configuration option of your firewall. Kind of like the previous option, you would just need to say, hey, I want to log these logs off to this syslog machine over here at this IP address, and then you could also pump them off to something like Elasticsearch or Splunk or your SIEM. Now the result is we have the internal IP address that queried that domain. Exercise 2 is what held that internal IP address. Maybe this was a week ago. You were in DHCP in your network. That IP address doesn't really give you any next step because you don't know the host or the user that's tied to that host that made that query. You need a next step here. So you need to know what host actually made that query. Some native options that you might have in your network already would be, of course, your DHCP server logs. Foreign things that you could introduce in your network might be something like a proxy with authentication enabled, so you could tie that network request to a user or a host name. And then again, a network security monitoring platform that we'll discuss. If you're using Microsoft for your DHCP server, pretty easy again. Enable DHCP audit logging. It'll output to this log location there in Windows System 32. And then again, collect centrally so it's easily searchable. BlueCat for DHCP, pretty similar to BlueCat for DNS. You'd say I want to log these centrally to a syslog IP address, input the IP address, then you're collecting them centrally. Now the result is we have the host that resolved evil.com. Exercise 3, have we seen a particular process on a Windows host? Some native options that you might have already, you just need to enable, is the audit process feature on Windows. Some foreign options that you could introduce is Sysmon, which was developed by Microsoft and gives you a lot more detail around processes that are being run on your Windows computers, or commercial options that give you similar logs to Sysmon. How you would configure the audit process feature is basically a group policy object. You would say, I want to enable this and this group policy, and then the computers that would apply to that group policy would pick up that configuration change. This is an example of the logs that the audit process feature gives you. It'll give you the username and the host name that was starting up that process, and then it'll also give you the full path and executable name that that was ran. And so this is good for if for example, you want to know if somebody was running psexec on all your machines. It would give you this and these logs. I mentioned Sysmon. It was recently released by Microsoft. It gives you a lot more detail around the processes that were being run. For example, it'll give you the file hash, the arguments that were being passed in the process at startup time. So say, for example, someone's running psexec-s-i cmd.exe to start up a CMD shell with system-level privileges. You get the whole -s-i cmd.exe in these logs, so it gives you a lot more context around what the process was doing when it was starting up, if it takes command flags, and if they were supplied. Another cool thing is it'll give you the parent process when it was started up. So say, for example, if you know this process should always have this parent process, if you see any deviation from that, you could alert off that, and you get that in these logs. Another great thing that it gives you is network connection to process details. So say, for example, in the previous examples where we saw a machine connecting out to a domain, but we don't have a lot of context around that, right? We just see this IP address resolve this domain over here. Well, it gives us a lot more context if we know the actual process that made that network connection. Say, for example, it was Chrome. Okay, that's a lot more context. Say, for example, it was some weird-looking executable name that might look like malware or something like that. That's a lot more context and is a lot more suspicious, so we might want to investigate that further. And it'll give you standard source IP, dest IP. It'll give you the destination host name if that's available, and then it'll give you the PID of the process that made that network connection. I mentioned that there's some commercial options that'll give you similar logs to Sysmon. Completely depends on your environment in terms of if you want to buy or go with something like Sysmon. Some pros and cons to commercial would be it takes care of a lot of things for you, like log searching, log forwarding, log alerting. Cons, of course, it would cost money. And then it's not written by Microsoft, so it could be argued that it's less performant or stable. Exercise 4 is what resources did the attacker access on my local network. Say, for example, you have a compromised IP address that you know to be compromised. You want to figure out on your local network what were they accessing. So I want to go and investigate those things further. Some native options might be configure logging on existing services. Like say, for example, you have hosts around your internal network that serve up like a wiki or a task tool or something like that. You want to make sure you're logging page loads and searches to that. NetFlow and switches from routers is something that you could be collecting internally. So say, for example, you were given a IP address on your internal network. You know this to be compromised from something else. Then you could figure out what assets that person has been reaching out to you on your local network and then go investigate those further because that might have been an attacker on that IP address accessing those local things on your network. Some foreign options that you could introduce in your network that might not already be there. If you have a service that doesn't have logging capability, you can maybe add a module, modify the code, add something like a reverse proxy in front of it so you can get connections that are going back to that application, or again, an NSM platform that we'll discuss. Some things that might be in your local network are things like code UIs, database UIs, wikis, or a task tool. Like I said, you want to make sure you're logging searches and page loads to that. So say, for example, you know an IP address to be compromised and they were accessing your code UI. Okay, cool. Now I want to know what they were accessing on my code UI. So I want to know what they were searching for and what they were loading up in the pages. Say, for example, they were searching for things like begin RSA private key. So they were searching for private keys that are committed in my code. I want to know about that. Some things that also might be in your local network are things like data stores. You also want to make sure you're logging connections and queries that are made on those data stores. And there's also, you need to think about production data store versus an internal like analytics data store, maybe like an HR system or something like that. It might not be totally viable for you to log all connections that are being made to your production data store that might be serving a lot of user traffic because the volume is just too high. But think about logging things on your internal network, logging queries to data stores for things like HR systems or things like a wiki tool. That shouldn't be too high volume and that should be plausible. Now the resulting capabilities that we have from all these exercises is we can figure out if we've seen traffic to a specific IP address or domain, what IP address on my network is responsible for that traffic, what machine did that IP address resolve to, so what was that actual host name, and then hopefully tie a user to that host name. Have we seen a particular process on a Windows host? And then what resources did the attacker access on my local network? So now we're evolving. we're standing up, we can almost walk, or we're getting a few more capabilities in our IR tool bag. Let's talk about our network security monitoring platform that we have and I've been hinting at. We have a network security monitoring platform for a corporate or employee network, and it's comprised of three things: Suricata, Bro, and ntop. Suricata is open source and known for being detection-driven, meaning it's great for things like network signatures, if you're seeing a specific piece of content in traffic, or IP reputation. If you have a bunch of known bad IP addresses, you can throw those in Suricata and say, let me know anytime I see connections out to these IP addresses. And since version 2.0, it's got some cool logging features where it can really dissect specific pieces of traffic. So it's, say, for example, a DNS request. It will tell you, okay, this IP address was resolving this DNS name, and here's also the response to that DNS request as well. It'll parse all that out for you and give you a nice log of that. I mentioned Suricata was detection-driven. So say, for example, a HTTP request. Over here on the right-hand side, you could basically alert off of anything within that HTTP request. The request header, the request body, the response header, the response body. Take any of these things in the screenshot here, and you could pretty much write a rule to say, if I see this, then let me know. HTTP is just one example of the many things that you can write signatures for. Here's an example signature that FireEye blogged about and released. So it's detecting CNC traffic from a specific piece of malware. So if the attacker was in the attack lifecycle where they're doing CNC and trying to establish initial points of presence on your network, you can detect them doing CNC. If they're in the portion of the attack lifecycle where they're doing data exfiltration, there is also a signature written by FireEye that can do that as well for this specific piece of malware. And don't just think about malware when you're thinking about writing network signatures. One thing that we've thought about writing network signatures for is trying to detect phishing pages. So say, for example, phishing page gets sent to one of your employees that's trying to impersonate an OWA or an Outlook Web Access page. It's usually or probably going to have the phrase Outlook Web App in that page. And if you see your employees loading up an OWA page over HTTP and not HTTPS like it should be to your legitimate page, then you might want to know about that. And you could also combine this with a lot of other phrases that might be in an OWA endpoint page that is a phishing page, and say, I want to write rules for this and let me know anytime I see this. As I mentioned, it's detection-driven. It runs off of signatures. You might be thinking, okay, well, that's great, but I don't have a lot of time to write signatures, or I don't have the skill of people that would be able to write signatures. That's fine. There's a lot of institutes that will give you free feeds or paid feeds of signatures. Emerging Threats is one of those, and you could subscribe to their free feed or pay for their feed, and you can get signatures for a lot of generic rats and Trojans and things like that. Bro is the second portion of our NSM stack. It's open source. It's a real framework for network logging and detection. We use Bro to create detailed logs for a bunch of different types of traffic, like DNS, DHCP, HTTP, HTTPS, SSH, SMB. And when it sees this type of traffic, it'll parse that traffic and pull out a lot of interesting details related to it. It won't just say, hey, I saw some SMB from this IP address to this IP address. For example, for HTTP, it'll pull out the URI, it'll pull out the user agent, it'll pull out the content type, and have those in distinct columns in your logs so that you can do searching and alerting based off of that. And then it'll also just give you raw connection logs and say, this IP address connected to this IP address using this protocol. I mentioned, or I didn't mention yet, but it informs detection. We use the intelligence framework for domain alerting, where we have a list of known bad domains, and we load those in Bro, and then say, anytime you see these, let us know. It can also do the same for any of the extractions that it's taking out from traffic, like IP addresses or URLs or file names or file hashes or certificate hashes if the traffic is HTTPS. This is an example of the Intel config and how that would look. In the top, you're loading that configuration into your Bro config, and then you're saying in the second portion, here's the text file that has all those IOCs. It's listed in a specific format that you just have to follow, and after you do that, then it'll tell you if it sees any of these IOCs in your text file. ntop is the third component. They made a piece of software called PF-Ring DNA. It really just enables 0% CPU utilization when moving packets to the network adapter to user space. This is really important if you're running software that wants to inspect traffic at a really high rate, like say, for example, 10 gigabits per second. You have Suricata on a box that wants to listen to a whole bunch of traffic, and it's going to stress out your operating system if you're not using something like pfRing to transfer that traffic from the NIC to user space where Bro or Suricata can consume it. Quick note on ntop and Bro, it wasn't playing too well together, but we worked with the Bro team to have them commit a fix to their open source repository. Now it works just fine, and so you can use the same. Let's go over a few infrastructure details and performance details around the NSM stack. Like I said, we use it for our corporate network. So if we're starting out with the 10 gig backbone that we have for our corp network, we're splitting that traffic off using a couple of NUIs, which is basically network packet brokers that can split out traffic to a bunch of different boxes. So say, for example, with Suricata, we're splitting out traffic to two different Suricata boxes at 5 gigs a second each. For the Bro boxes, we're using 4 Bro boxes, splitting that traffic out to 2.5 gigabits per second each. And then for the Bro logs, we're actually experimenting with shooting those off to an Elk stack or Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. The third box sees the full 10 gigs, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. This is a screenshot of Suricata running with 200,000 IPs loaded in the IP reputation system, 21,000 signatures, and then seeing 5 gigabits per second of throughput, and it's handling it just fine, load balance across a bunch of different cores using pfRing DNA. Same thing for Bro. 0 packets dropped. If we're in Bro control and issuing the netstat command, then we're seeing 0 packets dropped. We have loaded in 200,000 domains into our intelligence framework, and it's seeing up to 2.5 gigabits per second of throughput. The third box was something we developed, and we're open sourcing hopefully really soon. It's a Python XML RPC service that wraps ntdisk or time machine. Ntdisk or time machine is a way for PCAPs or traffic to be indexed and then retrieved. It allows the abstraction to happen when you are requesting a specific PCAP slice from a consumer that might be something like a HIDS, NIDS, or SIEM, or anything really. So, for example, a network intrusion detection system like Bro can say, hey, I saw something interesting. This IP address and this IP address was involved. Make a simple just XML RPC request to the service, and then it'll tell ntdisk or time machine to go and grab that traffic, store the PCAP on disk maybe, or shoot it off in an email, shoot it off to my SIM, whatever you want to do with it. So you could do that for anything. The unified 2 file that comes with Suricata and Snort kind of does a little bit of the same. If Snort or Suricata sees a signature hit, it'll say, hey, this packet matched that signature, and here it is. But that's only for Suricata and Snort. We kind of wanted to abstract that out so that we can say anything can do that. And this is what that looks like. If Bro or Suricata sees something interesting on the network, it'll tell the service, hey, given this source IP, dest IP, source port, dest port, please go and get the PCAP for it and store it or shoot it off to our SIM where an analyst can take a look at it, and here's the PCAP that was related to that piece of network traffic. Now we're evolving. We're standing up, we're walking, and we've got a knife, so we're a little bit more dangerous. We've talked about a few things related to IR, but let's look at the lifecycle as a whole. The NIST has a good framework on how you should be handling incidents and preparing for them, but it doesn't have a lot of good technical details, so let's go into that in these next slides. This is how we look at the IR lifecycle at Facebook, with intelligence, where you're gathering indicators to feed detection, and detection is feeding response when an incident begins, and then you're preparing, scoping, and containing that incident. Today, we're going to go into detection and response, specifically response, where we're going to talk about preparing, scoping, and containing an incident. When you're thinking about preparing for an incident, one of the things you might want to think about is communication. What we use for real-time communication is IRC. But the IRC server that we use is completely out of band from the rest of the systems in our network. So it doesn't bind to anything that IT has made, like LDAP or Active Directory or anything like that, because that might be compromised by an attacker from the incident that you're currently working. It's on dedicated infrastructure that's only available to our incident responders. So IT or production ops or anyone else, they can't SSH into it to manage it. Only we can. SSH requires a local account and 2-factor authentication. And then we're also using a bouncer for chat history and channel buffering. So if we're talking in a channel about an incident, somebody joins that channel, they get spit out the text that has been happening when they weren't in the channel, so they can get caught up really quickly on what's going on. I mentioned that it's not tied to any central authentication service. Our first red team made us suffer for this. They were able to infiltrate the server that we were doing communication on, and then were observing us talking about the incident as they were attacking us. Another thing that you might want to think about when you're preparing for an incident is how you're going to do production forensics. These are a few goals that we wanted to hit on when we were doing production forensics and building out an infrastructure to do that. And this is just one, a few slides on it, but we have a whole post on our Protect the Graph page where it goes into a lot more detail. Some goals that we wanted to hit on is we wanted to be able to remotely acquire evidence from a machine. We didn't want to have anyone, physically interact with that host to facilitate that. We wanted it to be fast. We wanted to preserve the integrity of the state of that machine. We wanted to, not introduce any additional risk to that process, so we wanted it to be secure. We wanted it to be documented and repeatable by anyone on our team. We also wanted a one-size-fits-all model where we can do this to any host in our production infrastructure. We also wanted to rely on open source tools. This is a few hardware stats on what our hosts look like in our production forensic infrastructure tier. Up to 8 cores, up to 36 terabytes of space, and that really helps out if you're acquiring an image from a server that might be like a database and it's storing a whole lot of information. And then the 10 gig NIC really helps out with the transfer speed. We have 2 forensic hosts in each data center, and then the area of compromise determines what forensic hosts we're going to use. So say, for example, there's a compromise on the West Coast, we're going to use the servers over there to help really reduce the time that it's going to take to transfer that data. If there's a compromise anywhere else, then we're going to use the hosts that are in that place. Chef lets us spin up forensic hosts really quickly if we need more, and then it'll also install a whole bunch of open source tools that'll help us do forensics like SleuthKit, Lime, Volatility, etc. Some of the stats that we saw on disk throughput were for a 1 terabyte root partition. We hit about 4.5 hours. We got that down to 2.6 with SSH compression, which was pretty awesome. Another thing that you're going to want to think about is how you're going to do corporate forensics. So when you're thinking about corporate forensics, you're thinking about things like maybe doing forensics on a phone or a laptop or a desktop. It introduces a lot more variables. One thing that we've learned from red teams that is key when you're collecting physical evidence during an incident is to use evidence bags. This helps you keep track of what evidence you're collecting, who collected it, when they collected it, why they collected it, who they collected it from. And if you're collecting, like 10 different pieces of physical evidence, this is really going to help out if they're all in evidence bags as opposed to just like a stack of laptops and you have no idea where you got them from. Also, storing that physical evidence in something like a safe would be a great idea. So it preserves them so that it's not damaged in something like a fire. No one can steal them if they might want to. And it also helps with the chain of custody. We have dedicated forensic examiner machines in our large remote offices and our HQ as well. There's a few different operating systems that we have on these examiners. For Windows, we have fresponse, Xways, and Autopsy are a few things that are installed on the Windows Forensic Examiner. On a Mac Forensic Examiner, we have fresponse again, Macquisition, and Blacklight installed. On a Linux Forensic Examiner, we have Sif3 installed, which is basically a collection of a bunch of open source forensic tools. We also use a NAS in our CORP forensic infrastructure where we're going to store the golden image that has been collected from a piece of evidence. So we're going to store that on a NAS where it's not going to be touched, and then on the examiner machine is where somebody's actually going to be investigating that, maybe modifying it or accidentally deleting it, but that's fine because we have a gold copy back on the NAS. That's no problem. Like I said, the examiner is where the working copy is being worked on. We've talked a little bit about how we would prepare for an incident. Now let's talk about how we would scope an incident. One of the first things you want to think about when scoping an incident is not to touch the attacker infrastructure because that results in direct notification to them that you know they're there. You want to avoid doing things like DNS queries against their domains, scanning their infrastructure, using wget or curl against their infrastructure, or even sandboxing malware with internet access because that could C2 back to them in the internet. Also, you shouldn't need to touch your compromised assets like I mentioned in the beginning. You should be able to figure out what's going on your hosts from the logs that you've been collecting from maybe something like OS query. You should be able to do that and get a good idea of what's been going on and why this asset is compromised and what has been happening on it. And like the Grux says on Twitter, practice good OPSEC. I just laid out a few rules, and obviously there's always exceptions to a rule. If you're ever observing active exfiltration of your data from your network into the hands of an attacker, then you would want to move directly to containment to stop that from happening. Some other things you want to think about when scoping an incident is notifying relevant internal stakeholders. So your CSO or PR or legal will really be happy if you involve them in an early phase of the incident. And you're also going to have an initial set of IOCs. You might want to think about doing some open source intelligence on those IOCs to gain more insight into what they are, but keeping in mind to not touch the attacker infrastructure during this. So things like whois or passive DNS lookups that actually don't query the domain, but will just give you a historical look on what IP address has mapped to that domain, or searching VirusTotal for hashes or something like that, but not uploading the malware itself to VirusTotal, because again, that could let the attacker know that you know they're there. Or Googling for something unique that would give you insight into what you're seeing. And depending on your risk tolerance, you might want to do this from a non-attributable network. Now you're going to have some initial IOCs. You're going to want to document those, things like file names, file hashes, domains, IP address, etc. You have a secondary set of IOCs you've got from open source intelligence. Now you're going to want to add those IOCs to your IDS system to identify any systems that are compromised by the incident that you're running going forward. What you're going to want to do with those IOCs also is search your logs to find any compromised assets that you might have missed historically. And when you're doing this, searching through logs and finding IOCs, you're really building a timeline of this attack, figuring out the attack vector, figuring out any lateral movement they might have taken, and getting a really good overview and picture of this incident as a whole. You also want to remember to triage the alerts that are coming in from your IDS systems. You're going to be, like I said, you're going to be adding IOCs to your IDS system to help detect compromised machines going forward. If you're not looking at those alerts that are coming in day to day, then you're going to miss those compromised assets that are directly related to the incident that you're working right now. Everyone's going to have a task, people are going to be stressed out and things like that, but you can't forget to triage the day-to-day alerts that are coming in from your IDS systems. Let's talk a little bit about containment. What you want to avoid when you're doing containment is this, whack-a-mole. You want to avoid containing one asset over here, and then if you didn't do proper scoping, you realize, oh, there's another asset over here that I missed, or the attacker was already on and they used a different method that I didn't know about, and now they're back in my network. Like this tweet is saying, you want to think about how you're going to do this before you actually have to do it, so you have good planning and you've tested this. You want to make sure you're containing all your assets at the same time because of the reason that I just outlined. If you don't do it all at the same time, then the attacker is going to know that you know they're there, and then they're going to pivot their tactics and maybe pivot to a tactic that you don't know about, and then you won't find them again on your network. And this will help you avoid the whack-a-mole scenario. And again, why I mentioned scoping is so important, that you identify all the compromised assets before you move into the containment phase. Some things you want to think about when you're doing containment, you want to think about what kind of requirements that host has, what kind of network requirements that host has. Does it need to talk internally, or does it need internet? Does it need to be up 24/7 or some downtime okay? What's the business criticality? Is it literally printing out money for my company, or is it like a meme generator? People actually might get mad if we took down the meme generator here. The locale, where is it? Is it an HQ, or is it a remote office? Is it corporate or production? These are all things you want to think about when you're thinking about preparing for containment. One of the options that we have for containment is Wi-Fi network ACLs. So let's just go over quickly how authentication works on our network with respect to Wi-Fi, and then we can get into how the containment works. Client authenticates to a wireless controller via ETLS. Certificate is validated. The username is pulled out from the certificate. Based on the group membership, Radius server assigns the client to a role. The role is returned to the wireless controller, which applies the ACL associated with that role. Okay. So what we've done is we've created two 802.1x roles that have ACLs, and we've distributed those to the controllers. We have an isolated role and an internal only role. The isolated role only allows them to communicate with our forensic host. The internal only role allows them to communicate internally in our internal network and our forensic host, of course, but not out to the internet. Same with the isolated role. So they can't C2 out to the attacker infrastructure on the internet. This is a little bit of what that looks like. On the left, we have the isolated role where it can't communicate internally or out to the network, but we can communicate to our forensic host where we can examine the host. But if we're doing the internal only role, it really helps in reducing employee friction because they can still access things like email, a task tool, a wiki tool, maybe they can still commit code, but they can't C2 out to the internet where the attacker might live. Another option that we have is sinkholing via DNS zones. We've built 2 servers, each with different dedicated IP addresses, one for a critical that we know is very critical and might be related to a security incident, and then another one for catch-all for some stuff that we're not kind of worried about, but we do want to sinkhole on our network. And when we want to sinkhole something, we just add a forward DNS lookup zone on our internal DNS servers that our clients are using and say this IP or this domain is over here at this IP address and not out on the internet. So you've sinkholed a domain. You now want to know what's hitting that sinkhole. You want to know if anyone is hitting this critical sinkhole domain that I just sinkholed and is hammering my sinkhole server. If you don't know about that, that might be bad. You definitely want to know about it. So what we've built is a sinkhole logger that kind of gives you some of the same log lines that a NSM might give you. But if it's deployed in somewhere in your network that you can't deploy an NSM or you don't have one, then you can use this. It's basically a Python service that utilizes libpcap and Scapy that an intern built for us, and it'll produce detailed logs for different types of protocols, kind of like an NSM would. This is a little bit on how that would look. For example, you have a user trying to get to evil.com that you know is to be bad. It's usually going to resolve to an IP address out on the internet at 53. whatever, but we've sinkholed it, so now it resolves to our sinkhole server over here and this internal IP address on our network. And then if it hits our critical sinkhole, then we'll get alerts for when somebody hits that. Eradication and recovery, we don't have a lot of time to talk about it today, so we'll leave that for another time maybe. But now we're a full, upright, walking human being. We have a lot of capabilities in our IR tool bag, and we're in a lot better situation with respect to incident response. Are there any questions?
Glad to see you mentioned evidence. When you're taking the images off of the potentially affected or infected, whatever, servers, and when you walk over to the server, you take the physical hard drive and you put it in the evidence bag, that's great. And you take an image from that and you've put it on your NAS that you can then do the work from. If you're also allowing them to continue or you're allowing the network to continue, how have you had legal look at, okay, you've taken an image, you're now working on it, you're taking evidence from it. Is that still considered evidence, even though it's an image that is now old?
Yeah, you said the magic word legal, which I do not have a lot of experience in. I can maybe hook you up with somebody that knows a little bit more about that, like somebody who built out the infrastructure to do some of that forensics and see what they think. But yeah, I'm not sure on legal terminology of what that would actually be at that point in time.
You said that you take packet captures. Is that all over your network, or is that in specific places?
Yeah, so the PCAP RPC service that I mentioned, that'll only, so it'll actually be, this might answer your question better, it'll be capturing PCAPs for everything that we're seeing, but it'll be a rolling window. So maybe we might only need to be storing traffic on that service for the last 30 minutes or 10 minutes because we want to query that when we see an interesting network event. And we don't need, all of the traffic that it's being seen to that IP address and source IP address. Maybe we probably just want a little bit of the traffic, so the last 2 minutes or something like that. Yeah, that is for our corporate stack. Yeah, the NSM was for our corporate stack.
Could you talk a little bit about tools and strategies for juggling, tracking, and pushing out indicators?
Yeah, so we do have actually a threat DB that we talked about on our Protect the Graph blog, actually, that you might be interested in, and that is where we track a lot of our indicators and things like that. And then we'll push them into systems like our IDS using Bro or Suricata or something like that. And then we'll use like the IP reputation framework in Suricata, or maybe the intelligence framework in Bro. But I think what you're asking about is like the database. And actually, yeah, somebody else built that. And so I might be able to loop you up with them. But yeah, definitely go to our Protect the Graph page. And it's basically, yeah, what you kind of mentioned. It's a database of threat indicators. And they talked about it a lot in that post.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about, obviously, our hosts are all over the place now. They're no longer on our network. So what are you guys able to do from communication point with your, do you have something agent-based? Are you able to get information, intelligence about your host when they're off network? And then as well, you were talking about the ways you deal with network connectivity when there is an incident. Are you concerned about potential unknown egress? Do you have any ways to detect those? What about people who might be proxying, those kinds of things?
So Windows actually has a great feature to help combat this. I think it's called active, I forget the actual terminology for it, but it's basically kind of like an always-on VPN. So you're always getting your logs from your sensors on your machine, no matter if they're on the network or off the network. But then there are a lot of considerations, like you mentioned, if the machine is off network or in a very remote office. I always suggest working with people who manage those hosts for their jobs. So like if we're talking about corporate assets, then talk to IT. Be like, hey, I want to do this. Give me, what are some good ways that I would be able to do this if it's on my network or off my network? And that's their job to help manage those assets. So they probably have all the cool tools that will enable you to do that. Same thing with production. Talk to your production guys. Say I have this problem. I want to do this, and then they probably have a lot of cool tools in their bag to help you with that. And that's actually what we've done. We've relied a lot on what IT has already built and a lot of what production has already built to help us do a lot of this IR stuff.
More questions? Thank you very much then.